Ever wondered how Alexander the Great forged an empire that changed the world? In just seconds, we're diving into the works of the ancient historian Arrian, titled The Anabasis of Alexander, to reveal the explosive beginnings of Alexander's empire. How it began. Before the legendary conquests, before the title Great, there was a young king facing immense challenges. How did Alexander, immediately after his father's assassination, consolidate power and launch the campaigns that would define his legacy? What seemingly small decisions in these early days laid the groundwork for an empire stretching across continents? In this video, we'll strip away the myths and rely on Arrian's unparalleled historical detail to show you the strategic brilliance and sheer audacity that marked Alexander's initial rise. You'll get the real story of his empire's birth. So hit that like button if you're ready for ancient history, let us know your favorite Alexander fact in the comments, and subscribe for more journeys into the past. The Anabasis of Alexander, Book 1. Chapter 1. Succession and Balkan Campaigns. Philip died when his son, Alexander, was about 20 years old. Alexander quickly secured his royal power and marched into Peloponnesus. There, he gathered all the Greek leaders and requested command of the expedition against the Persians, an honor previously given to Philip. All agreed except the Lacedaemonians, who stated it was their tradition to lead, not follow. The Athenians also considered political changes. However, Alexander's mere approach so alarmed them that they granted him even greater honors than Philip had received. Alexander then returned to Macedonia, preparing for the Asian expedition. In the spring of 335 BC, Alexander marched towards Thrace, into the lands of the Tribalians and Illyrians. He learned these nations were considering rebellion. Since they bordered his territory, he decided it was unwise to leave them unsubdued before embarking on a distant campaign. Setting out from Amphipolis, he invaded the land of the independent Thracians, keeping the city of Philippi and Mount Orbulus to his left. 10 days later, after crossing the Nessus River, he reached Mount Haemus. Here, along the mountain ascent, armed traders and independent Thracians blocked his path. They had seized the summit, the only route for his army. They positioned their wagons in front of them, using them as a defensive rampart. They also planned to release the wagons down the steepest parts of the mountain onto the Macedonian phalanx as it ascended. They believed the denser the phalanx, the more easily the wagon's violent descent would scatter it. Alexander devised a plan for the safest possible crossing. He was resolved to take all risks, knowing there was no other passage. He ordered his heavy-armed soldiers to open their ranks as the wagons began to roll down. Where the road allowed, they were to stand apart, letting the wagons pass through the gaps. Those hemmed in were to duck down or lie flat, locking their shields together compactly. He predicted the wagons would roll over their shields, perhaps even leaping over them due to their momentum, without causing injury. His plan worked exactly as he had envisioned. Some men created gaps, while others locked their shields. The wagons rolled over their shields with little harm. Not a single man was killed. This unexpected success bolstered the Macedonians' courage, as the dreaded wagons had inflicted no damage. With a loud cry, they attacked the Thracians. Alexander directed his archers to advance from the right wing, where the passage was easier, and shoot at the Thracians. He himself led his guard, the shield-bearing infantry, and the Agrianians to the left. The archers repelled the Thracians who sallied forward. The phalanx then engaged in close combat, easily driving away the lightly armed and poorly equipped barbarians. The Thracians did not wait for Alexander's left-wing advance. They threw away their weapons and fled down the mountain as best they could. About 1,500 were killed, but few were captured due to their swiftness and knowledge of the terrain. However, all the women, children, and booty accompanying them were captured. Alexander sent the spoils south to the coastal cities, entrusting Lysanias and Philotas with their sail. He then crossed the summit and advanced through the Haemus into Tribalian territory, reaching the Lycianus River. This river was a 3-day march from the Ister for someone heading towards the Haemus. Syrmus, the king of the Tribalians, had long anticipated Alexander's expedition. He had sent the nation's women and children ahead to the Ister, instructing them to cross into an island called Puus. Thracians whose lands bordered the Tribalians also sought refuge there upon Alexander's approach. Syrmus himself, with his retinue, fled to the same island. The main Tribalian force, however, retreated to the river from which Alexander had started the previous day. Upon learning of their movement, Alexander wheeled around and marched against them, surprising them as they were setting up camp. The surprised Tribalians formed a battle line in a woody glen along the riverbank. Alexander deployed his phalanx in a deep column and led it personally. He also ordered archers and slingers to advance and fire arrows and stones at the barbarians. He hoped to provoke them into leaving the wooded area for open ground. When the Tribalians were within range and struck by the missiles, they rushed out against the unshielded archers, intending to fight hand to hand. Once Alexander had drawn them out of the glen, he ordered Philotas to take the cavalry from Upper Macedonia and charge their right wing, where they had advanced furthest. He also commanded Heraclides and Sopoles to lead the cavalry from Bottiaea and Amphipolis against the left wing. Alexander himself extended the infantry phalanx and the remaining cavalry in front of it, leading them against the enemy's center. While skirmishing continued on both sides, the Tribalians held their own. But once the dense phalanx vigorously attacked, and the cavalry charged from various directions, not just with javelins but also pushing with their horses, the Tribalians finally turned and fled through the wooded glen to the river. 3,000 were killed in the flight. Few were taken prisoner because of the dense wood in front of the river and the approaching night, which hampered the Macedonian pursuit. Ptolemy recorded that 11 Macedonian cavalrymen and about 40 foot soldiers were killed. On the third day after the battle, Alexander reached the Ister River. It is the largest river in Europe, flowing through vast lands and separating warlike nations. Most of these belong to the Celtic race, in whose territory the river originates. The most distant of these nations are the Quadi and Marcomanni, then the Iazygians, a branch of the Sarmatians, then the Geti, who believe in immortality, then the main body of the Sarmatians, and lastly the Scythians, whose land stretches to the river's 5 mouths, where it empties into the Euxine Sea. Here, Alexander found warships that had come from Byzantium, through the Euxine Sea and up the river. He filled these with archers and heavy-armed troops, and sailed to the island where the Tribalians and Thracians had sought refuge. He attempted a landing, but the barbarians met him at the riverbank where the ships assaulted. However, the ships were few, and the army on board was small. Most of the island's shores were too steep for landing, and the river's current, confined by the narrow banks, was rapid and difficult to navigate against. Alexander therefore withdrew his ships. He decided to cross the Ister and march against the Geti, who lived on the other side. He observed many Geti gathered on the bank, ready to bar his way if he crossed. They numbered about 4,000 cavalry and over 10,000 infantry. At the same time, Alexander felt a strong desire to advance beyond the Ister. He boarded the fleet himself. He also filled the hides used for tent coverings with hay, and collected all the boats made from single tree trunks from the surrounding country. There were many of these boats, as the people near the Ister used them for fishing, river trade, and often piracy. He collected as many as he could, and used them to transport as many soldiers as possible. Alexander crossed with 1,500 cavalry and 4,000 infantry. They crossed during the night to a spot where the corn stood high, reaching the bank more secretly. At dawn, Alexander led his men through the standing cornfield, ordering the infantry to lean on the corn with their pikes held transversely as they advanced into the uncultivated ground. While the phalanx moved through the corn, the cavalry followed. Once they were out of the tilled land, Alexander led the cavalry to the right wing and commanded Nicanor to lead the phalanx in a square formation. The Geti did not withstand the first charge of the cavalry. Alexander's audacity seemed incredible to them, crossing the vast Ister so easily in a single night without a bridge. The tightly locked phalanx formation and the violent cavalry charge also terrified them. They initially fled to their city, about a parasang from the Ister. But when they saw Alexander cautiously leading his phalanx along the river to prevent his infantry from being ambushed, while his cavalry advanced directly, they abandoned the poorly fortified city. They carried off as many women and children as their horses could bear and fled into the steppes, heading as far as possible from the river. Alexander took the city and all the booty the Geti left behind, giving it to Meleager and Philip to carry off. After razing the city, he offered sacrifices on the riverbank to Zeus the Preserver, to Heracles, and to the Ister itself for allowing him to cross. While it was still day, he safely brought all his men back to camp. Ambassadors then came to him from Syrmus, king of the Tribalians, and from other independent nations living near the Ister. Some even arrived from the Celts, who dwelt near the Ionian Gulf. These Celts were tall and proud. All the envoys sought Alexander's friendship. He exchanged pledges of amity with all of them. He then asked the Celts what thing in the world caused them special alarm. He expected that his great fame had reached them, and they would say they feared him most. But the Celts' answer surprised him. Living so far from Alexander, in difficult-to-access regions, and seeing that he was about to set out in another direction, they said they feared the sky might fall on them. Alexander sent these men back as friends and allies, remarking that the Celts were braggarts. Chapter 2. The Illyrian Revolts. Alexander then advanced into the land of the Agrianians and Paeonians. Messengers reported that Clitus, son of Bardalus, had revolted, and Glaucias, king of the Taulantians, had joined him. They also warned that the Authoriatians intended to attack Alexander on his journey. He decided to begin his march immediately. Langarus, king of the Agrianians, a loyal friend of Alexander during Philip's lifetime, arrived with his best-armed shield-bearers, his personal guard. When Langarus heard Alexander asking about the Authoriatians and their numbers, he assured him they were the least warlike tribe in the region and should not be a concern. Langarus offered to invade their land himself, keeping them too occupied to attack others. Alexander agreed, and Langarus attacked, seizing captives and plunder. The Authoriatians were indeed preoccupied. Alexander rewarded Langarus with great honors and valuable gifts. He also promised his sister Cinna in marriage upon his return to Pella. However, Langarus fell ill and died on his way home. After this, Alexander marched along the Aragon River to the city of Pelium. Clitus had seized this city, as it was the strongest in the region. Alexander arrived and encamped near the Iordaicus River, planning to assault the wall the next day. Clitus held the thicket mountains encircling the city, dominating it from above. His intent was to attack the Macedonians from all sides if they assaulted the city. Glaucias, king of the Taulantians, had not yet joined him. Alexander led his forces towards the city. The enemy sacrificed 3 boys, 3 girls, and 3 black rams, then sallied forth to meet the Macedonians in hand-to-hand combat. However, as soon as they engaged, they abandoned their strong positions so quickly that their sacrificial victims were captured still lying on the ground. That day, Alexander trapped them in the city and encamped near the wall, intending to besiege them. But the next day, Glaucias arrived with a large force. Alexander then abandoned hope of capturing the city with his current strength. Many warriors had fled into it, and Glaucias, with his large army, would likely pursue him closely if he assaulted the wall. He sent Philotas on a foraging expedition with camp animals and enough cavalry for a guard. When Glaucias heard of Philotas's mission, he marched out to meet him and seized the mountains surrounding the plain where Philotas intended to forage. Alexander was informed that his cavalry and pack animals would be in danger if night fell. He quickly took the shield-bearers, archers, Agrianians, and about 400 cavalry to their aid. He left the rest of the army near the city to prevent the citizens from joining Glaucias, which they would have done if the entire Macedonian army withdrew. As soon as Glaucias saw Alexander approaching, he evacuated the mountains, and Philotas and his forces returned safely to camp. But Clitus and Glaucias still believed they had trapped Alexander in a disadvantageous position. They occupied the mountains, which overlooked the plain, with a large force of cavalry, javelin throwers, slingers, and a considerable number of heavy-armed infantry. Moreover, the men besieged in the city were expected to pursue the Macedonians closely if they retreated. The ground Alexander had to cross was narrow and wooded. On one side, it was hemmed in by a river, and on the other, by a very high, craggy mountain, leaving no room for the army to pass even for shield-bearers abreast. Alexander then arranged his army with the phalanx 120 men deep. He stationed 200 cavalry on each wing and ordered silence for quick command reception. He signaled the heavy infantry to first hold their spears erect, then couch them at a concerted sign. At one time, they inclined their spears to the right, tightly locked, and at another to the left. He then set the phalanx itself into rapid motion forward, marching it towards the wings, first right, then left. After arranging and rearranging his army many times with great speed, he finally formed his phalanx into a wedge. He led it towards the left against the enemy, who had long been amazed by the order and rapidity of his maneuvers. Consequently, they did not withstand Alexander's attack and abandoned the first ridges of the mountain. Alexander then ordered the Macedonians to raise the battle cry and clash their spears against their shields. The Taulantians, even more alarmed by the noise, rapidly led their army back to the city. Seeing only a few enemy soldiers still occupying a ridge along his route, Alexander ordered his bodyguards and companions to take their shields, mount their horses, and ride to the hill. If those who occupied the position awaited them, he instructed half of them to dismount and fight as foot soldiers, mixed with the cavalry. But when the enemy saw Alexander's advance, they abandoned the hill and retreated into the mountains in both directions. Alexander, with his companions, seized the hill and sent for the 2,000 Arrianians and archers. He also ordered the shield-bearing guards to cross the river, followed by the Macedonian infantry regiments. Instructions were given that upon crossing, they should form ranks to the left, so the phalanx of men crossing would appear compact at once. Alexander himself, in the vanguard, continuously observed the enemy's advance from the ridge. Seeing the force crossing the river, the enemy marched down the mountains to meet them, intending to attack Alexander's rear during his retreat. But as they drew near, Alexander rushed forth with his division, and the phalanx raised the battle cry, as if about to advance through the river. When the enemy saw all the Macedonians marching against them, they turned and fled. Alexander then led the Arrianians and archers at full speed towards the river, being the first to cross it. Seeing the enemy pressing upon the men in the rear, he positioned his war engines on the bank. He ordered the engineers to shoot all sorts of projectiles as far forward as possible. He directed the archers, who had also entered the water, to shoot their arrows from the middle of the river. Glaucias dared not advance within range of the missiles, so the Macedonians crossed in such safety that not one man lost his life in the retreat. 3 days later, Alexander discovered that Clitus and Glaucias were carelessly encamped. Their sentinels were not on guard, nor had they protected themselves with a rampart or ditch, as if they believed he had retreated out of fear. Their line was disadvantageously extended. Alexander secretly crossed the river again at nightfall, taking the shield-bearing guards, the Arrianians, the archers, and the brigades of Perdiccas and Caenis, having ordered the rest of the army to follow. As soon as he saw a favorable opportunity for attack, without waiting for everyone to be present, he dispatched the archers and Arrianians against the foe. These forces, arranged in a phalanx, fell upon the enemy's flank unexpectedly with a furious charge, striking where they were weakest. They killed some still in their beds, others were easily caught in their flight. Many were captured and killed, as were many in the ensuing disorderly and panic-stricken retreat. Not a few were also taken prisoner. Alexander pursued them as far as the Taulantian mountains. Those who escaped saved their lives by throwing away their weapons. Clitus first fled into the city, but then set it on fire and withdrew to Glaucias in the land of the Taulantians. Chapter 3. The Theban Revolt. During these events, some Theban exiles returned to the city by night. With the help of sympathetic citizens eager for a change in government, they apprehended and killed Amintas and Timolaus, two Macedonian commanders of the Cadmea fortress, who suspected no hostile action. Entering the public assembly, the exiles incited the Thebans to revolt against Alexander. They invoked liberty and freedom of speech, urging them to cast off the Macedonian yoke. They gained popular support by insisting that Alexander had been killed in Illyria. This rumor was widely believed, gaining credibility because of his prolonged absence and lack of news. As often happens in such cases, people, unaware of the facts, imagined what pleased them most. When Alexander learned of the Theban actions, he considered it a serious development. He had long suspected Athens and viewed the Thebans' audacious move as no trivial matter, especially if the Lacedaemonians, long disaffected, and the Aetolians, along with other wavering Peloponnesian states, joined the revolt. He led his army through Eordia, Illymiotis, and along the peaks of Stymphia and Paravia, arriving in Paulina, Thessaly on the 7th day. 6 days later, he entered Boeotia. The Thebans did not realize he had passed south of Thermopylae until his entire army was at Onchestus. Even then, the revolt's instigators claimed Antipater's army had arrived from Macedonia, vehemently asserting Alexander himself was dead and angry at those who said it was Alexander advancing. They claimed it must be another Alexander, son of Aripus. The next day, Alexander marched from Onchestus towards the city, along the territory consecrated to Iolaus. He encamped there, giving the Thebans more time to reconsider and send an embassy. However, they showed no sign of wishing for an agreement. Instead, their cavalry and a large force of light infantry sallied from the city to the camp, skirmishing with Macedonian outposts and killing a few men. Alexander dispatched his light infantry and archers to repel their sortie, which they easily did as the Thebans approached the camp. The following day, Alexander marched his entire army around to the gate leading to Eleutheræ and Attica. Even then, he did not assault the wall, but encamped near the Cadmea. This allowed him to support the Macedonians occupying the citadel. The Thebans had blockaded the Cadmea with a double stockade, guarding it to prevent external aid or internal sallies. Alexander remained encamped near the Cadmea, still preferring a peaceful resolution over conflict. Those Thebans who understood the Commonwealth's best interests wished to go to Alexander and seek pardon for their city. But the exiles and their supporters continued to incite the populace to war by every means, despairing of any leniency from Alexander, especially since some of them were also Boeotarchs. Still, Alexander did not assault the city. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, records that Perdiccas, stationed in the camp's vanguard with his brigade near the enemy's stockade, did not wait for Alexander's signal. He was the first to assault the stockade, breaching it and attacking the Theban vanguard. Amyntas, son of Andromenes, followed Perdiccas, having been stationed with him. Amyntas also led his brigade forward upon seeing Perdiccas inside the stockade. Alexander, seeing this, led the rest of his army, fearing the unsupported troops might be cut off and destroyed by the Thebans. He ordered the archers and Agrianians to rush within the stockade, but kept the guards and shield-bearing troops outside. Perdiccas, after forcing his way into the second stockade, was wounded by a dart and carried back to camp, severely injured, where he slowly recovered. However, Perdiccas's men, with the archers sent by Alexander, fell upon the Thebans, trapping them in the hollow way leading to the temple of Heracles and pursuing them to the temple itself. The Thebans then wheeled around, advanced with a shout, and routed the Macedonians. Eurybotes the Cretan, captain of the archers, fell with about 70 men. The rest fled to the Macedonian guard and royal shield-bearers. When Alexander saw his men fleeing and the Thebans breaking ranks in pursuit, he attacked them with his phalanx in proper order and drove them back within the gates. The Thebans fled in such a panic that they did not have time to shut the gates. The Macedonians, close behind the fugitives, rushed inside the fortifications, as the walls were undefended due to numerous pickets in front of them. Once inside the Cadmea, some Macedonians marched out with the fortress garrison into the other part of the city, opposite the temple of Amphion. Others, crossing along the walls now held by those who had rushed in with the fugitives, ran into the marketplace. The Thebans arrayed opposite the temple of Amphion held their ground briefly. But when Alexander's Macedonians were seen pressing them from various directions, the Theban cavalry rushed through the city and sallied into the plain. Their infantry fled for safety, each as best he could. Then, no longer defending themselves, the Thebans were slain. Not so much by the Macedonians, but by the Phocians, Plataeans, and other Boeotians, who indiscriminately vented their rage, exacting revenge for old injuries. Some were attacked in their houses while trying to defend themselves. Others were killed while seeking divine protection in temples. Not even women and children were spared. This was considered a general calamity by the Greeks, striking them with as much consternation as those directly involved. This was due to the size of the captured city and the swiftness of the action, which yielded results completely contrary to the expectations of both victims and perpetrators. The disasters that befell the Athenians in Sicily, though causing similar loss of life, saw their army destroyed far from home, composed mostly of auxiliary troops rather than native Athenians. Their city remained intact, allowing them to wage war for a long time afterward, even against the Lacedaemonians, their allies, and the great king. These disasters, therefore, did not create an equal sense of misfortune for those involved, nor did they cause similar consternation among other Greeks. Similarly, the Athenian defeat at Aegospotami was a naval one. The city suffered no humiliation beyond the demolition of the long walls, the surrender of most of its ships, and the loss of supremacy. However, they retained their hereditary government and soon recovered their former power. They rebuilt the long walls, regained control of the sea, and in turn, saved the very Lacedaemonians who had once threatened to obliterate their city. The Lacedaemonian defeats at Leuctra and Mantinea shocked them more by the unexpectedness of the disaster than by the number of casualties. Epaminondas's attack on Sparta by the Boeotians and Arcadians, while terrifying to the Lacedaemonians and their allies, was more due to the novelty of the sight than the actual danger. The capture of Plataea was not a great calamity, given the small number captured, as most citizens had long since fled to Athens. The capture of Melos and Saiwan concerned only island states, bringing more disgrace to the perpetrators than surprise to the wider Greek community. But the Theban revolt was sudden and ill-considered. The city was captured quickly and without difficulty by the attackers. The ensuing slaughter was great, as expected, carried out by fellow Greeks exacting revenge for ancient wrongs. The complete enslavement of a city that had excelled in power and military reputation among the Greek states was attributed, with some probability, to divine wrath. It seemed as if the Thebans were finally punished for their betrayal of the Greeks in the Median War, for seizing and enslaving Plataea during a truce, and for the un-Hellenic slaughter of men who had surrendered to the Lacedaemonians, instigated by the Thebans. They were also punished for devastating the territory where Greeks had arrayed against the Medes and repelled danger from Greece. Finally, their vote to enslave Athens when the Lacedaemonians' allies proposed it contributed to their fate. Moreover, it was reported that many divine portents preceded the disaster. These were ignored at the time, but later remembered, compelling people to believe that the events had been long foretold. Alexander entrusted the settlement of Theban affairs to the allies who had participated in the action. They resolved to garrison the Cadmea, raze the city to the ground, distribute all territory among themselves, except land dedicated to the gods, and sell into slavery the women, children, and surviving males. Exceptions were made for priests, priestesses, and those bound to Philip or Alexander by ties of hospitality, or who had been Macedonian public agents. It is said Alexander preserved the house and descendants of Pindar the poet, out of respect for his memory. Additionally, the allies decreed that Orchomenus and Plataea should be rebuilt and fortified. As soon as news of the Theban calamity reached other Greeks, the Arcadians, who had set out to aid Thebes, condemned to death those who instigated their assistance. The Hellenes welcomed back their exiles, who were Alexander's adherents. The Aetolians, each tribe individually, sent embassies to Alexander, begging pardon for their own attempts at revolution, prompted by the Thebans' false reports. The Athenians, celebrating the great mysteries when some Theban escapees arrived, abandoned their sacred rites in great consternation. They moved their belongings from rural areas into the city. The people assembled, and on Demades' motion, elected 10 ambassadors from among their citizens. These were men known to be Alexander's special adherents. They were sent to him, somewhat unseasonably, to convey that the Athenian people rejoiced at his safe return from Illyria and Triballia, and at the punishment he inflicted upon the Thebans for their rebellion. Alexander responded courteously to other matters, but wrote a letter to the people demanding the surrender of Demosthenes, Lycurgus, Hyperides, Polyeuctus, Chares, Charidemus, Ephialtes, Diotimus, and Morocles. He alleged these men caused the disaster at Kyrenia, and instigated the subsequent offensive actions against him and his father after Philip's death. He also declared they instigated the Theban revolt no less than the Thebans themselves who favored revolution. However, the Athenians did not surrender these men. They sent another embassy to Alexander, entreating him to relent his anger. The king did so, either out of respect for Athens or from an earnest desire to embark on his Asian expedition, without leaving behind any cause for distrust among the Greeks. However, he ordered Charidemus, alone among the demanded men, to go into exile. Charidemus, therefore, went into exile with King Darius in Asia. Chapter 4. Crossing into Asia and the legacy of Troy. Having settled these matters, Alexander returned to Macedon. There, he offered the customary sacrifice to Olympian Zeus, an institution established by Archelaus. He also held the Olympic Games at Aegae, and it's said he organized a public contest in honor of the Muses. Around this time, a curious report emerged. The statue of Orpheus, son of Oeagrus the Thracian, located in Pyrrhus, was sweating incessantly. Soothsayers offered various explanations for this phenomenon, but Aristander, a diviner from Telmissus, encouraged Alexander. He interpreted the sweating as a sign that epic and lyric poets, along with ode writers, would face much labor composing and singing about Alexander and his achievements. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander marched towards the Hellespont, entrusting the affairs of Macedon and Greece to Antipater. His forces numbered just over 30,000 infantry, including light-armed troops and archers, and more than 5,000 cavalry. His route took him past Lake Cercinitis, towards Amphipolis and the mouths of the Strymon River. After crossing the Strymon, he passed Mount Pangaean, following the road to the Greek coastal cities of Abdera and Maronia. From there, he reached and easily crossed the Hebrus River. He continued through Pietica to the Melas River, crossing it to arrive at Cestus, a journey of 20 days from his starting point. Upon reaching Elias, Alexander offered a sacrifice to Protesilaus at the hero's tomb. He did this for several reasons, one being that Protesilaus was considered the first Greek, part of Agamemnon's expedition to Ilium, to disembark in Asia. Alexander's intention was for his own landing in Asia to be more fortunate than Protesilaus. He then instructed Parmenio to transport the cavalry and most of the infantry from Cestus to Abydos. This was accomplished using 160 triremes and many trading vessels. The prevailing account states that Alexander departed from Elias, docked at the port of Achaeans, and personally steered the general's ship across the Hellespont. Midway through the channel, he sacrificed a bull to Poseidon and the Nereids, pouring a libation into the sea from a golden goblet. They also say he was the first to step ashore in Asia, fully armed. He erected altars to Zeus, the protector of those landing, to Athena, and to Heracles, both at his European departure point and his Asian landing site. It's also reported that he ascended to Ilium and sacrificed to the Trojan Athena. He dedicated his own armor in the temple and, in exchange, took some consecrated arms preserved from the Trojan War. These arms were said to have been carried before him into battle by his shield-bearing guards. A report also suggests he sacrificed to Priam at the altar of Zeus, the household god, to appease Priam's wrath against the lineage of Neoptolemus, from whom Alexander claimed descent. While in Ilium, Menoetius the pilot crowned Alexander with a golden crown. Following him, Chares the Athenian, arriving from Sigeum, along with other Greeks and natives, did the same. Alexander then garlanded the tomb of Achilles, and it's said Hephaestion similarly decorated Patroclus's tomb. Indeed, there's a report that Alexander declared Achilles fortunate for having Homer as the herald of his fame to posterity. It was fitting that Alexander would consider Achilles fortunate for this reason, especially as Alexander himself lacked such a privilege, which was inconsistent with his otherwise good fortune. Consequently, his achievements have not been recounted to mankind in a manner worthy of the hero. Neither in prose nor in verse has anyone suitably honored him, nor has he been sung of in lyric poems, a style in which figures like Hiero, Gelo, Thero, and many others not comparable to Alexander have been praised. Thus, Alexander's deeds are far less known than even the humblest achievements of antiquity. For instance, the march of the 10,000 with Cyrus into Persia against King Artaxerxes, the tragic fate of Clearchus and his captured companions, and their subsequent march to the sea under Xenophon's leadership, are all events much better known through Xenophon's narrative than are Alexander and his accomplishments. Yet, Alexander neither joined another's expedition nor did he, in flight from the great king, overcome those who obstructed his march to the sea. Indeed, no other individual, Greek or barbarian, achieved exploits as numerous or as great as he did. This was the reason I undertook this history, believing myself capable of making Alexander's deeds known. Whoever I may be, I know that my name is not unknown, nor is it necessary to state my native land, family, or public offices. But I do assert that this historical work has been, since my youth, my native land, family, and public office. For this reason, I do not deem myself unworthy to rank among the foremost authors in the Greek language, if Alexander truly ranks among the foremost in arms. From Ilium, Alexander proceeded to Arisbe, where his entire force had encamped after crossing the Hellespont. The next day he reached Percote. The day after, passing Lampsacus, he encamped near the Praxis River, which flows from the Idaean mountains and empties into the sea between the Hellespont and the Euxine. Continuing past the city of Colone, he arrived at Hermotus. He dispatched scouts ahead of the army under Amyntas, son of Arabeus. This force included the squadron of companion cavalry from Apollonia, led by Captain Socrates, son of Sathon, and 4 squadrons of prodromi, or runners forward. During the march, he sent Panegyrus, son of Lycagras, one of the companions, to seize the city of Priapus, which surrendered to him. The Persian generals Arzames, Rheomithres, Petines, Niphates, along with Spithridates, viceroy of Lydia and Ionia, and Arcides, governor of Phrygia near the Hellespont, were encamped near the city of Zelia with Persian cavalry and Greek mercenaries. During a council regarding the situation, they received news of Alexander's crossing. Memnon the Rhodian advised them not to risk a conflict with the Macedonians, as the Macedonians had superior infantry and Alexander was personally present, while Darius was not with the Persians. Memnon suggested advancing and destroying fodder by trampling it under their horses' hooves, burning crops, and not even sparing the cities themselves. For then, he argued, Alexander will be unable to remain in the land due to lack of provisions. It is said that in the Persian conference, Arcides declared he would not allow a single house belonging to the people under his rule to be burned. The other Persians agreed with Arcides, suspecting that Memnon was deliberately trying to prolong the war to gain favor from the king. Chapter 5. The Battle of the Granicus. Meanwhile, Alexander advanced towards the Granicus River, his army arrayed for battle. His heavily armed troops formed a double phalanx, with cavalry on the wings, and the baggage train following in the rear. Hegelicus, commanding the cavalry armed with long pikes and about 500 light-armed troops, was sent ahead to reconnoiter the enemy. When Alexander was near the Granicus, scouts galloped up, reporting that the Persians had taken position on the opposite bank, ready for battle. Alexander immediately prepared his entire army to fight. Parmenio then approached him, advising, "King, I believe it's best to camp on the riverbank for now. The enemy, being inferior in infantry, likely won't risk spending the night near us." This would allow our army to cross the ford easily at daybreak, before they can form ranks. Attempting to cross now, however, seems too risky. We can't lead the army across with its front extended. The river has deep sections, and you see the banks are steep, even abrupt in places. The enemy's dense cavalry squadrons will attack us as we emerge from the water, our ranks broken and in column, where we are weakest. A setback now would be hard to recover from and perilous for the entire war's outcome. Alexander replied, Parmenio, I recognize the strength of your arguments, but I would consider it a disgrace if, after easily crossing the Hellespont, this mere brook, he used this term to belittle the Granicus, should bar our passage for a moment. This would not align with the Macedonians' fame or my own eagerness for danger. Moreover, I believe the Persians would regain courage, seeing themselves as a match for Macedonians, having suffered no previous defeat from me to justify their fear. Having spoken, he sent Parmenio to command the left wing, while he led the right personally. On the right wing, he placed Philotas, son of Parmenio, with the companion cavalry, archers, and Agrianian javelin men. Amyntas, son of Arabius, with the long pike cavalry, the Paeonians, and Socrates' squadron, was positioned near Philotas. Close to these were the shield-bearing infantry companions, commanded by Nicanor, son of Parmenio. Next were the brigades of Perdiccas, son of Orontes, then Cenas, son of Polemocrates, then Craterus, son of Alexander, and Amyntas, son of Andromenes. Finally, the men commanded by Philip, son of Amyntas. On the left wing, the Thessalian cavalry, led by Culla, son of Harpalus, were first. Next were the cavalry of the Greek allies, commanded by Philip, son of Menelaus. Then came the Thracians, commanded by Agatho. Close to these were the infantry brigades of Craterus, Meleager, and Philip, extending to the center of the entire line. The Persian cavalry numbered about 20,000, and their infantry, composed of Greek mercenaries, was slightly less. They had extended their cavalry in a long phalanx along the riverbank, placing the infantry behind them, as the ground above the bank was steep and commanding. They also arrayed dense squadrons of cavalry at the spot where they saw Alexander himself advancing against their left wing. He was conspicuous both by his gleaming armor and the respectful service of his attendants. Both armies stood silently for a long time at the river's edge, each dreading the outcome. A profound silence fell over both sides. The Persians waited for the Macedonians to enter the water, intending to attack them as they emerged. Alexander leaped onto his horse, ordering those around him to follow and exhorting them to valor. He then commanded Amyntas, son of Arabius, to make the first rush into the river, leading the skirmishing cavalry, the Paeonians, and one regiment of infantry. In front of these, he had placed Ptolemy, son of Philip, in command of Socrates' squadron, which happened to lead all the cavalry that day. Alexander himself led the right wing, trumpets blaring and men raising the war cry to Enyalius. He entered the ford, keeping his line extended obliquely in the direction of the current. This was to prevent the Persians from attacking his flank as he emerged, allowing him to face them with his phalanx as much as possible. The Persians began the contest by hurling missiles from above, aiming where Amyntas's and Socrates' men were first reaching the bank. Some cast javelins into the river from their commanding position, while others stepped down to the water's edge along flatter parts. A violent struggle ensued as the cavalry tried to emerge from the river, and the Persians tried to prevent their landing. A terrible volley of darts came from the Persians, but the Macedonians fought with spears. Outnumbered, the Macedonians suffered severely at the initial assault. They had to defend themselves in the river, where their footing was unsteady, and they were below their assailants. The Persians fought from the top of the bank, an advantageous position, especially as their best cavalry was posted there. Memnon himself and his sons risked everything alongside them. The Macedonians who first clashed with the Persians, though fighting bravely, were cut down, except those who retreated towards Alexander, who was now approaching. The king was indeed nearby, leading the right wing. He made his first assault against the Persians where the main body of their cavalry and their leaders were positioned. A desperate conflict raged around him as one rank of Macedonians after another easily crossed the river. Though fought on horseback, it seemed more like an infantry battle, as horses and men were jammed together, struggling for mastery. The Macedonians strove to drive the Persians from the bank into the plain, while the Persians tried to obstruct their landing and push them back into the river. Finally, Alexander's men began to gain the advantage, both through superior strength and military discipline, and because they fought with spear shafts made of cornel wood, while the Persians used only darts. At one point, Alexander's spear shattered in the conflict. He asked Ardes, one of the royal guards whose duty it was to assist the king in mounting his horse, for another spear. But Aretas's spear had also broken in the thick of the struggle. He was conspicuously fighting with half his broken spear. Showing this to Alexander, he told him to ask someone else. Then Demaratus, a Corinthian and one of his personal companions, gave him his own spear. As soon as Alexander took it, he saw Mithridates, Darius's son-in-law, riding far ahead of others, leading a wedge-shaped body of cavalry. Alexander rode ahead, struck Mithridates in the face with his spear, and knocked him to the ground. At this, Rhoseis rode up to Alexander and struck him on the head with his scimitar, breaking off a piece of his helmet. However, the helmet absorbed the blow's force. Alexander then struck Rhoseis to the ground, hitting him in the chest through his breastplate with his lance. Spithridates, from behind, had already raised his scimitar against the king when Clitus, son of Dropidas, anticipated the blow and cut off Spithridates' arm, scimitar and all. Meanwhile, horsemen, as many as could, continued to land along the river and join Alexander's forces. The Persians and their horses were now being struck in the face by lances from all sides and repulsed by the cavalry. They also suffered heavy casualties from the light-armed troops mingled with the cavalry. They first began to give way where Alexander himself was bravely fighting at the front. When their center collapsed, the cavalry on both wings also naturally broke through and fled rapidly. Only about 1,000 Persian cavalry were killed, as Alexander did not pursue them far. Instead, he turned to attack the Greek mercenaries, the main body of whom remained in their initial position, more from shock at the unexpected outcome than from firm resolve. Leading the phalanx against them and ordering the cavalry to attack them from all sides, he quickly cut them down. None escaped except those who might have hidden among the dead bodies. About 2,000 were taken prisoner. The following Persian leaders also fell in battle: Niphates, Petines, Spithridates, viceroy of Lydia; Mithrabuzanes, governor of Cappadocia; Mithridates, Darius's son-in-law; Arbupales, son of Darius, son of Artaxerxes; Pharnaces, brother of Darius's wife; and Oneres, commander of the auxiliaries. Arcites fled the battle to Phrygia, where he is reported to have committed suicide, as the Persians held him responsible for their defeat. Of the Macedonians, about 25 companions were killed in the initial assault. Bronze statues of them, executed by Lysippus, were erected at Dium at Alexander's command. Lysippus also sculpted a statue of Alexander himself, chosen above all other artists. Over 60 other cavalrymen were slain, and about 30 infantrymen. Alexander buried them the next day with their arms and decorations. He granted their parents and children exemption from agricultural imposts and relieved them of all personal services and property taxes. He also showed great concern for the wounded, personally visiting each man, examining their wounds, and asking how and in what duty they received them, allowing them to speak and boast of their deeds. He also buried the Persian commanders and Greek mercenaries killed fighting for the enemy. However, he shackled the captured Greek mercenaries and sent them to Macedon to till the soil. He did this because, despite being Greeks, they had fought against Greece on behalf of foreigners, contrary to the decrees made by the Greeks in their federal council. To Athens, he sent 300 suits of Persian armor to be hung in the Acropolis as an offering to Athena, ordering this inscription: Alexander, son of Philip, and all the Greeks except the Lacedaemonians, present this offering from the spoils taken from the foreigners inhabiting Asia. Chapter 6. Consolidation in Asia Minor. After his victory, Alexander appointed Culla as viceroy of the territory previously ruled by Arcites. He ordered the inhabitants to pay the same tribute they had given Darius, and allowed those who descended from the mountains and surrendered to return home. He also absolved the people of Zelia, understanding their forced assistance to the Persians. Next, he dispatched Parmenio to occupy Decilium, which was easily accomplished as the garrison evacuated. Alexander then advanced towards Sardis. About 70 stades from the city, he met Mithraeus, the commandant of the Acropolis garrison, and Sardis's most influential citizens. They surrendered the city, and Mithraeus handed over the fortress and its treasury. Alexander encamped near the Hermus River, about 20 stades from Sardis. He sent Amyntas, son of Andromenes, to occupy the Sardis citadel. Treating Mithraeus with honor, Alexander granted the Sardians and other Lydians the right to their ancient laws and freedom. He ascended the citadel, held by Persians, and found it a strong, lofty position, precipitous on all sides and fortified by a triple wall. He decided to build a temple to Olympian Zeus on the hill. As he considered the best site, a sudden winter storm arose in summer, with loud thunder and rain falling on the former site of the Lydian king's palace. Alexander interpreted this as a divine sign for the temple's location and gave orders accordingly. He left Pausanias, one of the companions, as superintendent of the Sardis citadel. Nicias was tasked with supervising tribute collection, and Asander, son of Philotas, became superintendent of Lydia and Spithridates' former dominion, receiving sufficient cavalry and light-armed infantry for current needs. He also sent Culla and Alexander, son of Aripus, into Memnon's territory, commanding the Peloponnesians and most other Greek allies, except the Argives, who remained to guard the Sardis citadel. Meanwhile, news of the cavalry battle spread. The Greek mercenaries garrisoning Ephesus seized 2 Ephesian triremes and fled, accompanied by Amyntas, son of Antiochus. Amyntas had fled Alexander from Macedon, not from royal injury, but from ill will and fear of future mistreatment due to his disloyalty. On the 4th day, Alexander arrived at Ephesus. He recalled all exiles who supported him, abolished the oligarchy, and established a democratic government. He also ordered the Ephesians to contribute to Artemis all the tribute they usually paid to the Persians. Relieved of their oligarchic fears, the Ephesians violently killed those who had brought Memnon into the city, those who had plundered Artemis's temple, those who had overthrown Philip's statue in the temple, and those who had dug up and removed the bones of Hieropathus, their city's liberator, from his tomb in the marketplace. They also dragged Surfax, his son Pelagon, and Surfax's nephews from the temple and stoned them to death. Alexander, however, prevented further pursuit of other oligarchs for vengeance. He knew that unchecked, the people would kill innocent alongside guilty, some from hatred, others for property. At this time, Alexander gained great popularity through his actions, especially in Ephesus. Men arrived from Magnesia and Tralles, offering to surrender their cities. Alexander sent Parmenio with 2,500 Greek auxiliary infantry, an equal number of Macedonians, and about 200 companion cavalry. He also sent Lysimachus, son of Agathocles, with a similar force to the Aeolic cities and those Ionian cities still under Persian control. Lysimachus was ordered to dismantle oligarchies, establish democracies, restore each city's laws, and remit the tribute they paid to foreigners. Alexander himself remained in Ephesus, offering sacrifice to Artemis and conducting a procession in her honor with his entire army, fully armed and arrayed for battle. The next day he took the rest of his infantry, archers, Agrianians, Thracian cavalry, the royal squadron of companions, and 3 other squadrons, and set out for Miletus. In his first assault, he captured the outer city, as the garrison had evacuated it. He encamped there, resolving to blockade the inner city. Hegesistratus, Darius's commander of the Miletus garrison, had been sending letters to Alexander offering to surrender Miletus. But, regaining courage when the Persian fleet was near, he decided to hold the city for Darius. Nicanor, commander of the Greek fleet, anticipated the Persians by sailing into Miletus's harbor 3 days before their arrival. With 160 ships, he anchored at the island of Lade, near Miletus. The Persian ships, arriving too late and finding Nicanor already at Lade, anchored near Mount Mycale. Alexander had further secured the island, not only by mooring his ships nearby, but also by transporting Thracians and about 4,000 other auxiliary troops onto it. The foreign fleet numbered about 400 ships. Despite the Persian fleet's superiority, Parmenio advised Alexander to fight a sea battle. He expected Greek victory for several reasons, especially due to a divine omen. An eagle had been seen sitting on the shore, opposite the stern of Alexander's ships. Parmenio argued that a victory would greatly benefit their war aims, and even a defeat wouldn't be significant, as the Persians already controlled the sea. He offered to join the fleet and share the danger. However, Alexander replied that Parmenio was mistaken and misinterpreted the sign. It would be rash to fight a much larger fleet with only a few ships, and to pit an inexperienced naval force against the disciplined Cyprian and Phoenician fleets. Furthermore, he didn't want to entrust the Macedonian advantage of skill and courage to the unstable sea against foreigners. A naval defeat would greatly hinder their final success, especially by emboldening the Greeks to revolt upon hearing of it. Considering these factors, he declared it wasn't the right time for a sea battle. He interpreted the divine omen differently. He agreed the eagle favored him, but its presence on land suggested he should master the Persian fleet by defeating their army on land. At this time, Glaucippus, a prominent Milesian, was sent to Alexander by the people and the Greek mercenaries, who controlled the town more than the citizens. Glaucippus offered to share their walls and harbors with both Alexander and the Persians and asked him to lift the siege. Alexander ordered Glaucippus to return to the city immediately and tell the citizens to prepare for battle at daybreak. Alexander then positioned his siege engines near the wall. In a short time, he breached a large section and shook down another, leading his army close so men could enter where the wall was broken or weakened. The Persians from Mycale were close behind, almost witnessing their friends and allies under siege. Meanwhile, Nicanor, observing Alexander's attack from Lade, sailed into Miletus harbor along the shore. Mooring his triremes as close as possible, prows facing the enemy, across the narrowest part of the harbor mouth, he blocked the Persian fleet, preventing them from aiding the Milesians. The Macedonians then pressed the citizens and Greek mercenaries from all sides. They fled. Some cast themselves into the sea, floating on their upturned shields to an unnamed islet near the city. Others took to skiffs, trying to outpace the Macedonian triremes, but were captured at the harbor mouth. Most, however, were slain in the city itself. As soon as Alexander captured the city, he sailed against those who had fled to the island, ordering ladders carried on the triremes' prows, intending to land on the island's cliffs as one would scale a wall. But seeing the islanders resolve to fight to the last, he pitied them for their bravery and loyalty. He made a truce. They would serve as his soldiers. These Greek mercenaries numbered about 300. He also pardoned all Miletus citizens who survived the capture and granted them freedom. The foreigners regularly sailed from Mycale to the Greek fleet, hoping to provoke a battle. At night, they moored near Mycale, an inconvenient station requiring them to fetch water from the distant Meander River mouth. Alexander guarded Miletus harbor with his ships to prevent the foreigners from forcing an entry. At the same time, he sent Philotas to Mycale with cavalry and 3 infantry regiments, ordered to prevent any landings from the ships. Consequently, due to scarcity of fresh water and other provisions, essentially besieged in their ships, they sailed to Samos. After resupplying, they sailed back to Miletus. They then positioned most of their ships in the deep sea outside the harbor, hoping to draw the Macedonians into open waters. 5 of their ships sailed into the roadstead between Lade Island and the camp, expecting to surprise Alexander's ships while their crews were absent. They had learned that many sailors were dispersed, gathering fuel, provisions, or on foraging parties. Indeed, many sailors were absent. But as soon as Alexander spotted the 5 Persian ships approaching, He manned 10 ships with available sailors and swiftly sent them to attack prow to prow. The men on the 5 Persian ships, seeing the Macedonians bearing down unexpectedly, immediately tacked about from afar and fled to the rest of their fleet. The Iasian ship, however, being slow, was captured with its crew. The other 4 escaped to their triremes. After this, the Persians sailed away from Miletus without achieving anything. Chapter 7. The Halicarnassus Campaign. Alexander now decided to disband his fleet. This was partly due to a lack of money, but also because he recognized his fleet was no match for the Persian navy in battle. He was unwilling to risk losing even a portion of his forces. Furthermore, he believed that by occupying Asia with his land army, he would no longer need a fleet. He reasoned he could dismantle the Persian fleet by capturing coastal cities, depriving them of ports to recruit crews or harbors in Asia for their ships. Thus, he interpreted the omen of the eagle to mean he would gain mastery over enemy ships with his land forces. After these decisions, he advanced into Phrygia, having received reports that a significant force of foreign and Greek auxiliaries had gathered in Halicarnassus. He swiftly captured all cities between Miletus and Halicarnassus. Then, he encamped near Halicarnassus, about 5 stades away, anticipating a prolonged siege. The city's natural position made it strong, and any defensive weaknesses had been thoroughly addressed by Memnon, who was now Darius's appointed governor of Lower Asia and commander of the entire Persian fleet. Many Greek mercenary and Persian soldiers had been stationed in the city, and triremes were moored in the harbor, their sailors ready to assist in the defense. On the first day of the siege, as Alexander led his men toward the gate facing Mylaisa, the city's defenders launched a sortie. A skirmish ensued, but Alexander's troops quickly repelled them and forced them back into the city. A few days later, Alexander took his shield-bearing guards, the cavalry companions, the infantry regiments of Amintas, Perdiccas, and Meleager, along with archers and Agrianians. He moved around to the part of the city facing Myndus. His objective was to inspect the wall for potential weak points and to see if he could seize Myndus in a sudden, secret attack. He believed that controlling Myndus would greatly aid the siege of Halicarnassus. Moreover, the Myndians had offered to surrender if he approached secretly under cover of night. Around midnight, Alexander approached the wall as planned. However, no sign of surrender came from within. Although he had no siege engines or ladders, as his intent was to receive the town, not besiege it, he still led the Macedonian phalanx forward and ordered them to undermine the wall. They brought down one of the towers, but its collapse did not create a breach. The defenders fought stoutly, and many reinforcements from Halicarnassus had arrived by sea, making it impossible for Alexander to capture Myndus by surprise. Therefore, he returned without achieving his objectives and refocused on the siege of Halicarnassus. First, he filled the enemy's ditch, which was about 30 cubits wide and 15 deep, in front of the city. This would allow his siege towers to advance easily, from which he planned to launch missiles at the wall's defenders and to bring up other engines to batter down the wall. He quickly filled the ditch, and the towers were then moved forward. However, the men in Halicarnassus launched a night sally, intending to set fire to the towers and other engines. They were easily repelled and driven back inside the walls by the Macedonian guards and others who were roused by the commotion. Neoptolemus, brother of Arabius and a defector to Darius, was killed along with about 170 other enemy soldiers. Of Alexander's men, 16 were killed and 300 wounded. The night sally made it harder for them to defend against injuries. A few days later, 2 Macedonian hoplites from Perdiccas's brigade, who shared a tent and meals, began boasting about their exploits. Their conversation escalated into a quarrel over who was braver. Fueled by wine, they agreed to arm themselves and deliberately assault the wall facing the citadel, mostly oriented towards Mylaisa. Their aim was to display their valor, not necessarily to engage in a dangerous fight. Some city defenders, seeing only 2 men approaching the wall recklessly, rushed out. The 2 Macedonians killed those who came close and hurled spears at those who kept their distance. Eventually, however, They were overwhelmed by the superior numbers of their attackers and their own disadvantageous position as the enemy attacked from higher ground. Meanwhile, other men from Perdiccas's brigade and from Halicarnassus rushed out, clashing fiercely near the wall. Those who had sallied from the city were driven back and shut within the gates by the Macedonians. The city itself narrowly escaped capture. At that time, the walls were not strictly guarded, and 2 towers, with the entire section between them, had already fallen, offering an easy entry if the whole army had attacked. A third, severely shaken tower could also have been easily brought down. However, the enemy quickly built a crescent-shaped brick wall to replace the fallen section, leveraging their large workforce. The next day, Alexander brought his engines up to this new wall. The city's defenders made another sally to set them on fire. A part of the wickerwork shed near the wall and a section of one wooden tower were burned, but Philotas and Helanicus, in charge of the engines, protected the rest. As soon as the sallying party saw Alexander, those carrying torches dropped them, and most threw down their arms and fled back inside the city. Initially, they held an advantage due to their elevated position, allowing them to cast missiles directly at the engine guards. From the 2 towers still standing at each end of the battered wall, they could also target the flanks and even the backs of those assaulting the newly built inner wall. A few days later, Alexander again moved his military engines up to the inner brick wall, personally overseeing the work. A mass sortie erupted from the city. Some advanced through the breach where Alexander was positioned, while others attacked through the triple gate, where the Macedonians least expected them. The first group hurled torches and other combustibles at the engines, aiming to set them ablaze and defy the engineers. But when Alexander's men vigorously counterattacked, launching large stones from the towers and darts, the enemy was easily routed and fled back into the city. As a great number had sallied forth and fought with considerable audacity, a significant slaughter occurred. Some were killed in hand-to-hand combat, others near the wall's ruins, as the breach was too narrow for such a multitude to pass through, and the debris made scaling difficult. The second group, sallying from the triple gate, was met by Ptolemy, one of the royal bodyguards, with the regiments of Aeneas and Timander and some light-armed troops. These soldiers easily routed the city's men. However, as the retreating enemy fled over a narrow bridge built over the ditch, its weight caused it to collapse. Many fell into the ditch, some trampled by their own comrades, others killed by Macedonian weapons from above. A massive slaughter also occurred at the gates themselves, which were shut prematurely in panic. Fearing the Macedonians, who were close behind the fugitives, would rush in with them, the enemy shut out many of their own, who were then killed by the Macedonians near the walls. The city narrowly escaped capture. Indeed, it would have been taken had Alexander not called back his army, hoping for a friendly sign of surrender from the Halicarnassians, as he still wished to save their city. About 1,000 city defenders were slain. Of Alexander's men, approximately 40 were killed, including Ptolemy, a royal bodyguard, Clearchus, a captain of archers, Aeneas, who commanded 1,000 infantry, and other high-ranking Macedonians. Then Orontibates and Memnon, the Persian commanders, met. They concluded that, given the fallen and weakened wall sections and the heavy casualties among their soldiers from sorties, they could not withstand the siege much longer. Considering these factors, around the second watch of the night, they set fire to the wooden tower they had built to counter the enemy's siege engines and to their weapons magazines. They also threw fire into houses near the wall. Other houses were consumed by flames, carried furiously from the magazines and tower by the wind. Some of the enemy then withdrew to the stronghold on the island, called Arrian, and others to another fortress called Salmachus. When this was reported to Alexander by deserters, and he himself witnessed the raging fire, he let out the Macedonians, even though it was around midnight. They killed those still setting fires in the city, but Alexander ordered that all Halicarnassians found in their homes be spared. At daybreak, he could see the strongholds occupied by the Persians and Greek mercenaries. However, he decided not to besiege them, believing it would cause significant delay due to their strong positions and considering them of little importance now that he had captured the entire city. Therefore, after burying the dead that night, he ordered the siege engines moved to trolleys. He himself marched into Phrygia, after razing the city to the ground. He left 3,000 Greek infantry and 200 cavalry under Ptolemy to guard Halicarnassus and the rest of Curia. He appointed Ada as his viceroy over all of Curia. Queen Ada was the daughter of Hecatomnus and wife of Hydrius, her brother, as was customary among the Carians. Upon Hydrius's death, he entrusted the administration of affairs to her, as it had been a custom in Asia since the time of Semiramis for women to rule. But Pixodarus expelled her and seized control. After Pixodarus's death, his son-in-law Orontabates was sent by the Persian king to rule the Carians. Ada retained only Alinda, the strongest place in Curia. When Alexander invaded Curia, she met him, offering to surrender Alinda and adopting him as her son. Alexander entrusted Alinda to her and accepted the title of son. Furthermore, after capturing Halicarnassus and gaining control of the rest of Curia, he granted her the privilege of ruling the entire country. Chapter 8. Advances into Lycia, Pamphylia, and Phrygia. Some Macedonians in Alexander's army had married just before his expedition. Alexander, unwilling to neglect them, sent them back from Curia to spend the winter in Macedonia with their wives. He placed them under the command of Ptolemy, son of Seleucus, one of his bodyguards, and the general Caenis, son of Polemocrates, and Meleager, son of Neoptolemus, as they were also newly married. He instructed these officers to levy as many horse and foot soldiers as possible from Macedonia when they returned with their men. This act greatly endeared Alexander to the Macedonians. He also sent Cleander, son of Polemocrates, to levy soldiers in Peloponnesus and Parmenio to Sardis. Parmenio was given command of a regiment of cavalry companions, the Thessalian cavalry, and the rest of the Greek allies. Alexander ordered him to take the wagons to Sardis and advance from there into Phrygia. Alexander himself marched towards Lycia and Pamphylia to secure control of the coastland, thereby rendering the enemy's fleet useless. His first objective was Hyparna, a strong position garrisoned by Greek mercenaries. He took it in the first assault and allowed the Greeks to depart under a truce. Then he invaded Lycia, bringing the Telmicians to terms by capitulation. Crossing the Xanthus River, the cities of Pinera, Xanthus, Patera, and about 30 other smaller towns surrendered to him. Having accomplished this, despite the depth of winter, he invaded the land called Milias, a region of Great Phrygia that at the time paid tribute to Lycia by arrangement with the great king. Envoys from Phaselis came to him there, seeking his friendship and offering a golden crown. Most of the coastal Lycians also sent ambassadors with the same request. Alexander ordered the Phasalites and Lycians to surrender their cities to his envoys, and all complied. Soon after, he arrived at Phaselis himself, and helped the city's inhabitants capture a strong fort built by the Pisidians to control the region. From this fort, the Pisidian barbarians had often inflicted damage on the Phasalites who farmed the land. While still near Phaselis, Alexander received information that Alexander, son of Aripus, a companion and then commander of the Thessalian cavalry, was conspiring against him. This Alexander was the brother of Heramenes and Arabius, who had participated in Philip's murder. At that time, King Alexander had pardoned him, despite accusations of complicity, because after Philip's death, he was among the first friends to come to him, helping him with his breastplate and accompanying him to the palace. The king later honored him, sending him as general to Thrace. When Kala, the commander of the Thessalian horse, was sent away to a viceroyalty, Alexander, son of Aripus, was appointed to succeed him. The details of the conspiracy were reported as follows. When Amyntas deserted to Darius, he conveyed messages and a letter from Alexander, son of Aripus, to Darius. Darius then sent Sisines, one of his faithful Persian courtiers, to the coast, ostensibly to meet Atizes, viceroy of Phrygia. His true mission, however, was to communicate with Alexander, son of Aripus, and offer him pledges. If he killed King Alexander, Darius promised to make him king of Macedonia and give him 1,000 talents of gold in addition to the kingdom. But Sisinnes was captured by Parmenio and revealed the true purpose of his mission. Parmenio immediately sent him under guard to the king, who obtained the same intelligence. King Alexander then gathered his friends to deliberate on how to proceed regarding Alexander, son of Aripus. The companions believed that previously, the king had unwisely entrusted the best part of his cavalry to a disloyal man. Now, they advised eliminating him as quickly as possible before he gained more popularity among the Thessalians and attempted a revolution with their help. Moreover, they were alarmed by a divine portent. While King Alexander was besieging Halicarnassus, he was resting at midday when a swallow flew above his head, twittering loudly. It perched alternately on either side of his couch, chirping more noisily than usual. Despite his fatigue, he couldn't be roused from sleep. Disquieted by the sound, he gently brushed it away. But even when struck, the swallow did not attempt to escape. Instead, it perched directly on the king's head and did not desist until he was fully awake. Believing the swallow incident to be significant, he consulted the soothsayer Aristander the Telmician, who interpreted it as a plot by one of his friends. He added that the plot would be discovered because the swallow was a bird fond of human society, well-disposed and more talkative than other birds. Comparing this with the Persians' depositions, the king sent Amphoterus, son of Alexander and brother of Craterus, to Parmenio. With him, he sent some Phrygians to guide the way. Amphoterus, disguised in local dress to avoid recognition, stealthily reached Parmenio. He carried no letter from Alexander, as the king deemed it unwise to write openly about such a matter, but he verbally delivered the message. Consequently, Alexander, son of Aripus, was arrested and placed under guard. Alexander then moved from Phaselis, sending part of his army to Perga through the mountains, where Thracians had cleared a difficult and long road for him. He himself led his brigade along the coastal beach, a route only passable when the north wind blew. If the south wind prevails, the beach is impassable. At that time, after a strong south wind, north winds blew, making his passage easy and swift, which both he and his men interpreted as divine intervention. As he advanced from Perga, he was met by fully empowered envoys from the Aspendians, who offered to surrender their city, but begged him not to station a garrison within it. Having secured their request regarding the garrison, they departed. However, he ordered them to pay 50 talents for his army, and to hand over the horses they were rearing as tribute to Darius. Having agreed to the money and promised to deliver the horses, they left. Alexander then marched to Side, whose inhabitants were Cimmerians from Cyme in Aeolus. These people recounted that their ancestors, starting from Cyme, arrived in that country and disembarked to establish a settlement. They immediately forgot the Greek language and began to speak a foreign tongue, not that of neighboring barbarians, but a unique speech that had never existed before. From that time, the Citans spoke a foreign language unlike neighboring nations. Leaving a garrison inside, Alexander advanced to Cilium, a strong place garrisoned by Greek mercenaries and native barbarians. However, he was unable to take Cilium immediately by sudden assault. On his march, he received intelligence that the Aspendians refused to honor their agreements. They would neither deliver the horses to those sent to receive them, nor pay the money. Instead, they had moved their property from the fields into the city, shut their gates against his men, and were repairing dilapidated sections of their walls. Hearing this, he marched to Aspendus. Most of Aspendus had been built upon a strong, precipitous rock, at the base of which flowed the Eurymedon River. Around the rock, on lower ground, were many citizens' houses, surrounded by a small wall. As soon as they realized Alexander was approaching, the inhabitants abandoned the outer wall and the houses on low ground, believing them indefensible, and fled en masse to the rock. When Alexander arrived with his forces, he passed within the deserted wall and occupied the abandoned houses. When the Aspendians saw that Alexander himself had come, contrary to their expectation, and that his camp surrounded them on all sides, they sent envoys entreating him to agree to the former terms. Alexander, considering the strength of the place and his unpreparedness for a long siege, entered into an agreement with them, though on harsher terms than before. He ordered them to provide their most influential men as hostages, hand over the horses they had previously agreed to give, pay 100 talents instead of 50, obey the viceroy he appointed, and pay an annual tribute to the Macedonians. Furthermore, he directed an inquiry into the land they were accused of holding by force, which rightfully belonged to their neighbors. With all these concessions made, he marched away to Perga, and from there set out for Phrygia, his route passing the city of Termessus. The people of this city are foreigners of the Pisidian race, inhabiting a very lofty place, precipitous on every side, making the road to the city difficult. A mountain stretches from the city to the road, where it abruptly ends. Opposite it rises another equally steep mountain. These mountains form natural gates on the road, allowing even a small guard to make passage impossible. On this occasion, the Termessians had come out en masse and occupied both mountains. Seeing this, Alexander ordered the Macedonians to encamp there, armed as they were, anticipating that the Termessians would not remain in force once they saw the bivouac. He expected most would withdraw into their nearby city, leaving only a sufficient guard on the mountains. His conjecture proved correct. Most retired, and only a guard remained. He immediately took the archers, javelin thrower regiments, and lighter hoplites, and led them against those guarding the pass. When attacked with missiles, they did not hold their ground, but abandoned the position. Alexander then passed through the defile, and encamped near the city. While he was there, ambassadors came to him from the Seljuns, also Pisidian barbarians, who inhabited a large, warlike city. Because they were long-standing enemies of the Termessians, they had dispatched this embassy to seek Alexander's friendship. He made a treaty with them and found them faithful allies in all his subsequent actions. Despairing to capture Termessus without significant delay, he marched on to Sagalassus. This too was a large city, inhabited by Pisidians. While all Pisidians were warlike, the men of Sagalassus were considered the most so. On this occasion, they had occupied the hill in front of the city, as it was as strong as the walls, from which to attack the enemy. There they awaited him. Alexander arrayed the Macedonian phalanx as follows. On the right wing, where he positioned himself, he placed the shield-bearing guards, and next to them, he extended the foot companions as far as the left wing, according to the precedence of each general that day. On the left wing, he stationed Amyntas, son of Arabius, as commander. In front of the right wing were posted the archers and Agrianians, and in front of the left wing, the Thracian javelin throwers under Cytalus' command. However, the cavalry was useless in such rough and unfavorable terrain. The Termessians had also come to aid the Pisidians and arrayed themselves with them. Alexander had already attacked the mountain occupied by the Pisidians, advancing up the steepest part of the ascent, when the barbarians from an ambush attacked him on both wings. This was a place easy for them to maneuver, but very difficult for their enemy. The archers, who approached first, were routed due to insufficient armor. But the Agrianians held their ground as the Macedonian phalanx, led by Alexander himself, was drawing near. When the battle became hand-to-hand, the barbarians, despite lacking armor, charged the Macedonian hoplites and fell wounded on all sides. They then gave way after about 500 had been killed. Being nimble and familiar with the terrain, they retreated without difficulty. In contrast, the Macedonians, due to their heavy armor and unfamiliarity with the roads, dared not pursue them vigorously. Alexander therefore ceased pursuit of the fugitives and took their city by storm. Of his own men, Cleander, the general of the archers, and about 20 others were slain. Alexander then marched against the rest of the Pisidians, taking some strongholds by storm and winning others over through capitulation. From there, he went into Phrygia, passing by Lake Ascania, where salt naturally forms. The locals used this salt and had no need for sea salt. On the 5th day of his march, he arrived at Selene, a city with a fortified, precipitous rock. This citadel was occupied by the viceroy of Phrygia with a garrison of 1,000 Carians and 100 Greek mercenaries. These men sent ambassadors to Alexander, promising to surrender the place if succor did not reach them by an agreed-upon date. This arrangement seemed more advantageous to Alexander than besieging the inaccessible fortified rock. At Selene, he left a garrison of 1,500 soldiers. Remaining there for 10 days, he appointed Antigonus, son of Philip, as viceroy of Phrygia, and placed Balacrus, son of Amyntas, as general over the Greek allies in Antigonus's place. He then directed his march to Gordium. He sent an order to Parmenio to meet him there with his forces, an order Parmenio obeyed. The newly married men who had been sent to Macedonia also arrived at Gordium, along with another levied army. This army was under the command of Ptolemy, son of Seleucus, Cenas, son of Polemocrates, and Meleager, son of Neoptolemus. It consisted of 3,000 Macedonian foot soldiers, 300 horse soldiers, 200 Thessalian cavalry, and 150 Hellenes under the command of Alcias the Illyrian. Gordium is in Hellespontine Phrygia, situated on the Sangarius River, which rises in Phrygia, flows through Bithynian Thracian land, and empties into the Euxine Sea. Here, an embassy from the Athenians reached Alexander, imploring him to release Athenian prisoners captured at the Granicus River, who had fought for the Persians and were now in Macedonia serving in chains with 2,000 others captured in that battle. The envoys departed without obtaining their request for the prisoners at that time. Alexander did not deem it safe, while the war against Persia continued, to in any way lessen the terror he inspired in the Greeks, who did not consider it shameful to serve as soldiers for foreigners against Greece. However, he replied that once his current enterprise was successfully completed, they might return as ambassadors to plead on behalf of the same persons.